Most of you probably already will have seen some information published by news outlets regards rent payment holidays and support for tenants overall. And this is coming from the government effectively saying that they don't want anyone to become homeless during this difficult time for the UK as it deals with trying to get a handle on controlling and minimising the effect of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, now, as we have a little bit more detail and we look at exactly what the government intends with this, we can kind of look at this a little bit more and take a practical view of what this actually means for those operating a property portfolio. Okay, so ultimately there's been a suspension of evictions for tenants was one of the big headlines that came out. Now, what this actually means at this stage is that courts are not listing possession hearings right now for new hearings, although it does look like if there were notices served prior to this legislation coming into effect, and there was maybe an application for possession lodged prior to this coming into effect, those things that were already making their way through the system will still be allowed to go through. And this is an important point. It actually ties in with some of the stuff around financing as well. There's some rules here around tenants being in arrears, property owners being in arrears, that coronavirus can't be used as an excuse for a situation that you were already in before. Yes, banks, landlords, the government, everyone should understand that this is going to be a difficult time for a lot of people and allowances need to be made at this time, but it's not, a way of kind of mopping up the fact that maybe someone was already behind on payments for the last 3 or 4 months and, really they can't afford to be where they are. So that's worth bearing in mind. So what we do have, and effectively what the change in legislation means, is not that you can't serve a notice if there is genuinely a problem with a tenant in your property. What it means is that where before, if you were serving a Section 8 notice or a Section 21 notice, or you were serving notice under the PRT regime in Scotland, some of those notice periods have periods that are shorter than 3 months notice you can provide. Sometimes 14 days, sometimes 2 months. Now what this legislation that's been brought in actually means is that all notices served now, whatever the reason is for the notice being served, is dated for 3 months. That goes through to the end of this initial 3-month period that the government has put in place. So that means that if there is a problem with the tenant, if possession proceedings need to start, they're not starting for at least another 3 months, with the view that that will keep tenants in properties, reduce homelessness at what's already a difficult time. Now, ultimately as a landlord, I don't want to be serving notices at this point in time anyway, because I don't want to be adding to the stress that people already have around this situation, making people homeless at this difficult time. But if there was a situation where maybe a tenant is taking advantage of this situation, trying it on, I suppose, because they think that they don't need to pay rent in this time, then I still have the ability to serve a notice if I need to. Now, I would hope that people don't do that, and that if any tenants are coming to me as a landlord and saying they're in difficulty because of coronavirus, it's genuinely because of that. They can also produce some evidence to support that, and we can be practical and work out a way to keep them in the property, agree a payment plan, something that will be affordable for when they get back on their feet once these lockdown measures from the government's end and once life starts getting back to normal, hopefully sooner rather than later. So rent repayment holidays. Now, when this first came out, I think there was maybe a perception that it would be very, very easy for a tenant just to say, I can't pay the rent, I won't pay the rent for the next 3 months, and there would be nothing else said about that. Now, what has actually been published now in terms of government legislation, what's been published in terms of guidance as well, is something that's a little bit different, and this is actually probably a much more sensible option overall. Okay, so when we're talking about rent repayment holidays, what we're talking about here is a situation where a tenant has maybe lost their job, has significantly reduced working hours, and it's a direct result of measures around the coronavirus kind of lockdown that the government's put in place, or they're ill themselves and they have to self-isolate, which means that they can't work. If that's the situation there, it should be relatively easy for them to produce some evidence to that effect. and that goes to the landlord. Then the landlord and the tenant, maybe with the lettings agent in the middle, can agree a reasonable payment plan. Now, what this means is not necessarily no payments for the next 3 months. What this means is maybe we have to be a bit pragmatic and practical as a landlord. If my tenant has lost their job and they need to go on to claiming universal credit, there may be a 4 to 6 week delay in their payments coming through. So that might mean I might miss a rental payment. But then once their universal credit payment comes in, they should be able to pay something. Now, universal credit, the local housing allowance, may not cover the full rent, but because they're getting that housing component of universal credit or that local housing allowance rate, they should be able to pay something towards their rent. And that's what we're being encouraged to do. Tenants should pay something towards their rent because ultimately this is a payment holiday. It's not a removal of the debt that they owe. It's saying in this difficult time you may not be able to pay your full rent. You will need to pay the balance later on. And so it's in the tenant's interest as well as the landlord's interest to have something being paid across during this time, because if they pay absolutely nothing, they're storing up a big debt for later on, and that may be unaffordable. So really what the guidance is that you should be working proactively with tenants to work out what they can afford to pay in the current climate, to work out what a payment plan might be and sort of making plans for where they might be in terms of catch-up payments in 3 months' time, what their increased payment might look like down there so that they can catch up over a period of time later on and agree something that's suitable for both sides. That's the way of looking at this. What the government is not saying and what the industry is not saying is that this is a case of nothing comes in for landlords over this period of time. It's agree a reasonable payment plan between yourself and your tenants that will be affordable for the tenants, so that you're encouraging them to stay in the property, that ultimately also will not leave them with a huge debt that they need to repay once this crisis is over, and also allows you as a landlord to still have some income coming in so that you can service your mortgage as well.